1944, the road to Rome was blocked by a mountain that swallowed armies.
By the spring of 1944, men arriving at Monte Cassino stopped calling it a battlefield. They called it the mountain that swallowed armies. From miles away, soldiers could already see smoke drifting above the shattered hillsides, rising into the cold Italian sky like something alive. Entire slopes had been ripped apart by artillery fire so constant that veterans later said the ground never seemed to stop trembling. And above it all, sitting on the peak like a silent stone fortress watching the destruction below, stood the ancient abbey of Monte Cassino. To the men climbing toward it, that monastery no longer looked holy. It looked cursed. For months, wave after wave of Allied soldiers had been sent toward the mountain, and for months, many never came back down. Americans, British, French, Indians, New Zealanders, Poles, units from across the world were thrown into the fight, each believing they might finally break through the German defensive line that blocked the road to Rome. But the mountain kept consuming them. Rain turned trails into rivers of mud. Sharp rocks shredded boots, and exhausted men slipped down steep slopes carrying heavy packs, ammunition, and radios through darkness so thick they could barely see the soldier walking beside them. Then came the shell fire. It arrived without warning, echoing across the valley before smashing into cliffsides and narrow paths where troops had nowhere to hide. Many soldiers later admitted the waiting was worse than the explosions themselves. Every minute climbing upward felt like stepping deeper into a trap they could not escape. What made Monte Cassino terrifying was not just the danger. It was the feeling that the mountain itself was fighting back. German paratroopers hidden among caves, ruins, and stone fortifications controlled nearly every approach. Machine gun fire erupted from positions attackers could barely see. Snipers watched the valleys below through shattered walls and broken trees. During the night, exhausted soldiers listened to distant screams echo through the hills, while mules carrying supplies stumbled along dangerous mountain paths under constant fire. Some men disappeared in the fog and were never seen again. Others survived the battle physically, but carried Monte Cassino in their minds for the rest of their lives. And yet, what happened here became even worse after one decision changed the entire battle forever. A decision that many believed would end the nightmare quickly. Instead, it turned Monte Cassino into something far more brutal than anyone had imagined. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe if you enjoy untold stories from history's darkest battlefields, and let me know in the comments which World War II battle you believe pushed soldiers to their absolute limit. Because Monte Cassino was not simply another fight in Italy. It became a place where hope slowly disappeared beneath rain, stone, exhaustion, and fear, and where thousands of men realized too late that surviving the mountain could be harder than defeating the enemy itself. Most people looking back at the Italian campaign imagine a simple problem. One mountain, one monastery, one stubborn German defense line standing between the Allies and Rome. But the reality facing soldiers in early 1944 was far worse than that. The men sent toward those hills quickly discovered they were not fighting for a single building. They were fighting through an entire maze of ridges, rivers, shattered villages, hidden artillery positions, and steep slopes that seemed designed to stop human movement itself. The Germans understood this perfectly. Long before Allied troops reached the area, defensive positions had already been carved into the mountains surrounding the valley. Observation posts overlooked nearly every approach road for miles. Mortars hidden among rocks could strike advancing troops within seconds. Narrow trails forced soldiers into predictable paths where even small defensive teams could delay entire assaults. And above all of it sat the Gustav Line, one of the strongest defensive systems built by Germany during the war. To Allied commanders, breaking through central Italy meant reaching Rome before the campaign stalled completely. To the men on the ground, however, strategy meant very little once they entered the valleys beneath the mountains. There, survival became the only thing that mattered. Soldiers arriving near the Rapido River often expected a hard battle. What they did not expect was how exposed and helpless they would feel the moment the attack began. The river itself became a nightmare obstacle. Cold winter water soaked uniforms within minutes. Heavy gear dragged exhausted men downward, while artillery bursts echoed through the foggy darkness. Radios failed. Units became separated. Officers lost track of their own companies in the confusion. In some places, troops crossed open ground, believing they were nearing German lines, only to discover they had entered carefully planned kill zones overlooked from higher elevations. Veterans later described the area as a battlefield, where every hill seemed alive with hidden fire. During the day, aircraft circled overhead, while artillery shook the valleys. At night, soldiers listened to falling rocks, distant engines, and nervous whispers traveling through muddy foxholes. Sleep became almost impossible. Food arrived late or frozen. Stretchers carrying wounded men slipped through narrow mountain trails under freezing rain. Even experienced combat veterans from North Africa and Sicily admitted they had never seen terrain this unforgiving. Yet, the deeper problem was psychological. Monte Cassino created the terrifying feeling that progress meant nothing. Entire battalions fought for days to capture a ridge, only to lose it again hours later beneath counterattacks and shell fire. Some Allied soldiers later confessed that after enough failed assaults, they stopped thinking about victory altogether. They focused only on surviving until sunrise. The mountain had begun draining more than manpower. It was draining confidence. And still, high above the battlefield, the ancient abbey remained untouched. Through smoke and rain, soldiers constantly saw its silhouette overlooking the destruction below. Some believed German observers were using it to direct artillery fire. Others saw it as a symbol of the entire deadlock, a silent stone fortress standing over thousands of exhausted men trapped in a battle that seemed to have no end. By February 1944, many Allied soldiers had started to understand a frightening truth. The battle was no longer moving toward Rome. It was stuck beneath the mountains, trapped in mud, rain, exhaustion, and fear. Every failed assault seemed to drag the campaign deeper into a nightmare that nobody had expected would last this long. Yet despite the heavy losses and constant delays, commanders knew they could not stop. Rome remained the ultimate objective, and every road leading north passed through this deadly bottleneck in central Italy. That was why fresh troops kept arriving at the front, even as survivors from previous attacks stumbled back down the hills, looking hollow and exhausted. Men from New Zealand, India, Britain, France, and the United States rotated into positions where shattered stone walls and flooded trenches had already become familiar to countless others before them. Many arrived confident. Most lost that confidence within days. The weather alone seemed determined to break them. Cold rain swept across the valleys almost non-stop, turning foxholes into pools of muddy water. Supply trucks struggled through narrow roads already damaged by artillery craters and landslides. Mules carrying ammunition slipped along steep mountain trails, while engineers worked desperately to repair bridges under constant observation from German positions high above. Some soldiers later joked bitterly that the mountains belonged to the enemy and the valleys belonged to death. What terrified many Allied troops most was how invisible the battlefield felt. Unlike the open deserts of North Africa, here the enemy was hidden inside cliffs, caves, ruined houses, and thick stone fortifications built directly into the mountainside. German paratroopers from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had transformed the terrain into a fortress. They were experienced, disciplined, and perfectly positioned. Soldiers climbing uphill often heard gunfire long before they saw where it came from. Entire units advanced through fog and darkness, not knowing whether the next ridge was empty or filled with waiting defenders. The mountains distorted sound in strange ways. A single rifle shot could echo through the valleys, while artillery bursts rolled across the hills like thunder. During the night, nervous troops sometimes fired at shadows or moving trees, convinced enemy patrols were creeping toward them through the darkness. Sleep became dangerous because attacks could begin at any moment. Men wrapped themselves in wet blankets beside ruined stone walls while freezing winds swept down from the mountains. Some wrote letters home describing the battle as endless. Others stopped writing altogether. But high above all of this suffering stood the abbey. Through binoculars, soldiers watched its ancient walls overlooking the valleys below. To many Allied troops, it seemed impossible that such a commanding position was not somehow helping German defenders. Rumors spread constantly across the front lines. Some claimed German observers inside the monastery directed artillery fire onto Allied positions. Others insisted enemy officers were hiding within its thick stone walls. Whether true or not, the abbey slowly became more than a building in the minds of exhausted soldiers. It became a symbol of the entire stalemate. The mountain could not be taken while the monastery remained untouched. At least, that was what many believed. And soon, commanders facing growing pressure to break the deadlock would make a decision that changed everything. A decision that many later called one of the most controversial moments of the entire Italian campaign. The decision came after weeks of frustration, exhaustion, and mounting pressure from Allied commanders who could not understand how one position continued holding back entire armies. Reports from the front described soldiers pinned down beneath constant observation while attack after attack collapsed against the mountains. Some officers became convinced the abbey itself had to be part of the problem. They believed German artillery observers hidden within its walls were directing fire onto Allied troops moving through the valleys below. Pilots flying reconnaissance missions reported seeing movement near the monastery. Infantrymen staring upward from muddy positions swore enemy spotters were watching them through ancient windows high above the battlefield. Yet not everyone agreed. Some intelligence officers insisted there was no clear proof German troops occupied the abbey itself. The monastery was one of the oldest religious sites in Europe, a sacred place that had stood for centuries above the valleys of Italy. Destroying it carried enormous cultural and symbolic consequences. But by February 1944, patience across the front had almost vanished. Soldiers freezing in flooded foxholes did not care about history anymore. To them, the abbey had become the eyes of the mountain, and slowly, pressure built toward a single conclusion. If the monastery remained standing, the deadlock might never end. Then came the morning that changed Monte Cassino forever. Allied bombers appeared above the mountains in massive numbers, their engines echoing across the valleys, while soldiers below watched the sky in silence. Many believed this was finally the moment the nightmare would end. Men standing beside ruined stone walls looked upward with cautious hope, convinced the destruction of the abbey would shatter German defenses and open the road toward Rome at last. When the bombing began, the entire mountain seemed to disappear beneath smoke, dust, and falling debris. Explosions rolled across the hills, while ancient walls collapsed into enormous clouds of stone and rubble. For hours, wave after wave of aircraft struck the monastery overlooking the battlefield below. Some soldiers cheered as pieces of the abbey vanished into the smoke. Others simply stared, exhausted beyond emotion. Veterans later described the bombardment as surreal, as though centuries of history were being erased in front of them within a single afternoon. But as the dust slowly settled across the mountains, an unsettling realization began spreading through the Allied lines. The bombing had not ended the battle. In some ways, it had made everything worse. Before the attack, German paratroopers had largely stayed outside the abbey itself in defensive positions surrounding the mountain slopes. Now, the shattered ruins created perfect cover among broken stone walls, collapsed corridors, and piles of debris thick enough to absorb artillery blasts. What had once been an open structure visible from below had transformed into a massive fortress of rubble. Soon afterward, German defenders moved directly into the ruins and turned the destroyed monastery into one of the strongest defensive positions on the entire front. Allied troops advancing uphill now faced hidden machine gun nests, sniper positions buried inside collapsed walls, and defenders nearly impossible to dislodge. Soldiers who had hoped the bombing would save lives instead found themselves climbing toward an even deadlier battlefield than before. And as the next assaults began, many realized the mountain was no longer simply holding them back. It was trapping them inside a battle that seemed to grow more brutal every single day. After the destruction of the abbey, the battlefield changed completely. Soldiers advancing toward the mountain no longer saw an ancient monastery overlooking the valley. They saw a shattered maze of stone, smoke, and broken walls rising above them like the ruins of another world. Every collapsed corridor, every pile of rubble, every fractured staircase had become part of the defense. The bombing that was supposed to clear the way had instead created the perfect battlefield for experienced German paratroopers who knew exactly how to use the terrain to their advantage. Allied units climbing uphill soon discovered how impossible the ruins were to attack. Tanks struggled to move through narrow mountain roads already cratered by shellfire and blocked by debris. Infantrymen advanced slowly across loose stone and shattered walls, while hidden defenders fired from positions almost invisible beneath the rubble. Some soldiers later said it felt less like fighting an army and more like fighting the mountain itself. Every ruined structure concealed danger. Every shadow between collapsed walls seemed to hide another machine gun nest or sniper position waiting for movement below. The weather only made conditions worse. Rain soaked uniforms day and night, while cold wind swept through the exposed hillsides. Mud clung to boots until every step uphill felt exhausting. Radios malfunctioned in the damp conditions, and runners carrying messages often became lost among the shattered slopes. At night, the battlefield turned almost unreal. Flares illuminated broken stone towers for a few brief seconds before darkness swallowed everything again. Men stumbled through ruins carrying ammunition boxes and stretchers, while artillery bursts echoed endlessly through the valleys below. Some soldiers later admitted they completely lost track of time during those days. Morning, night, exhaustion, fear, and shellfire blended together into one endless struggle to survive another hour. Yet despite everything, the attacks continued. Allied commanders could not afford another failure. Rome remained less than 80 miles away, but the entire advance through Italy still depended on breaking the Gustav Line. Fresh assaults were organized again and again as exhausted units rotated in and out of the front lines. Polish troops prepared for attacks along steep ridges, while New Zealand and Indian forces fought through valleys and ruined villages beneath the mountain. French colonial units pushed through rough terrain where even supply mules struggled to move. Each new assault carried the same hope that this attack might finally succeed where the others had failed. But the deeper troops moved into the battlefield, the more hopeless conditions became. Casualties mounted from exhaustion, exposure, falling debris, artillery fire, and relentless counterattacks. Some positions changed hands multiple times within a single day. Entire companies became separated in fog and smoke, while officers struggled to understand where their own men were located among the ruins. Veterans later described Monte Cassino as one of the few battles where soldiers constantly felt surrounded by destruction, even when no fighting was happening directly around them. The mountain never felt quiet. There was always distant shellfire, falling stone, shouting in the darkness, or the sound of aircraft overhead. And slowly, another realization began spreading among the exhausted Allied troops. Even if they eventually captured the ruins, victory itself no longer felt glorious. Too many men had already disappeared into the mountain. Too many attacks had collapsed beneath rain, exhaustion, and fear. Monte Cassino was no longer simply blocking the road to Rome. It had become a scar that every soldier on that front would carry with them long after the battle finally ended. By the spring of 1944, the battlefield beneath the mountain no longer resembled a traditional military campaign. It had become a landscape of exhaustion, where entire units measured success not by captured territory, but by how many men remained standing at the end of each day. Soldiers moving toward the front passed endless lines of shattered vehicles, exhausted mule trains, and medical teams struggling through mud and debris under constant pressure. The roads leading toward Cassino were packed with traffic day and night. Tanks crawled through narrow mountain routes, while engineers rebuilt bridges almost as quickly as artillery destroyed them again. The deeper troops moved toward the front lines, the quieter they became. Veterans recognized the look immediately. Monte Cassino drained men before they even entered combat. New arrivals often stared upward at the ruined monastery in silence, already understanding why so many others had failed there before them. By now, the mountain had developed a terrifying reputation across the Allied armies. Stories spread from unit to unit about attacks disappearing into fog, patrols losing direction among shattered cliffs, and exhausted soldiers collapsing from exposure after days without proper sleep. Some men joked darkly that the mountain collected nationalities the way other battlefields collected wrecked tanks. Americans, British, Poles, Indians, French, New Zealanders, and Canadians had all fought there. Many left believing they had stepped into one of the most punishing battlefields of the entire war. Yet despite everything, preparations for another major offensive continued. Allied commanders understood that if the Gustav Line could not be broken, the campaign in Italy might remain stalled indefinitely. Massive quantities of artillery were brought forward, while fresh divisions prepared for coordinated assaults across the valleys and mountain slopes surrounding the ruins. During the nights before the attack, soldiers cleaned weapons beneath freezing rain, while officers studied maps already stained with mud and exhaustion. Some men wrote final letters home. Others simply sat in silence, listening to distant shellfire echo through the darkness. Many had stopped talking about victory altogether. They talked instead about weather, food, sleep, and whether anyone could actually survive climbing the mountain again. When the new offensive finally began in May 1944, the scale of the assault shook the entire front. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire across the valleys while Allied aircraft roared overhead. The ground trembled beneath constant explosions as infantry units pushed forward through smoke, rubble, and shattered terrain. Polish forces attacked steep ridges near the monastery itself, while French units fought through mountainous terrain farther south. British and American forces pressed against heavily defended positions throughout the valley. For the soldiers advancing uphill, however, the battle still felt terrifyingly personal. Visibility vanished beneath smoke and dust. Men became separated within minutes. Officers shouted orders no one could hear over artillery bursts crashing through the mountains. Yet something had changed. German defenders, though still dangerous and disciplined, were beginning to show signs of exhaustion themselves after months of relentless fighting. Slowly, and at terrible cost, Allied troops started pushing deeper into positions that had seemed untouchable for so long. Ruined strongpoints fell one by one, while exhausted defenders withdrew through collapsing defensive lines. Then finally, after months of fighting, a patrol reached the shattered abbey itself. What they found was not triumph. It was silence, broken stone, drifting smoke, and the remains of a battlefield that had consumed thousands of lives. The mountain had finally been taken, but for many soldiers standing among the ruins that day, victory no longer felt like victory at all. When Allied soldiers finally stood inside the ruins overlooking the valley below, many expected relief. They had spent months climbing through mud, shattered rock, freezing rain, and constant shellfire to reach this place. Rome now seemed closer than ever. The Gustav Line had finally cracked. Newspapers back home would later describe the breakthrough as a major victory in the Italian campaign. But for the men who survived the mountain, the feeling was far more complicated. The abbey itself no longer resembled the ancient monastery that had once watched peacefully over central Italy for centuries. Its walls were shattered. Stone corridors had collapsed into heaps of rubble. Dust drifted through broken archways, while smoke still lingered across the slopes below. Soldiers moved carefully through the ruins, exhausted beyond celebration. Some stared silently at the destruction around them, unable to believe how much had been sacrificed for a single position on a mountain. Others searched for familiar faces among surviving units and realized how many were gone. Veterans later admitted that reaching the summit felt strangely empty. The battle had consumed too much time, too many men, and too much hope for victory to feel clean anymore. Yet even as Allied forces pushed northward after the breakthrough, Monte Cassino refused to leave the minds of the soldiers who fought there. Long after the front moved beyond the mountains, survivors carried vivid memories of the battlefield with them. Many remembered the sounds first, the endless artillery echoing through the valleys, the crashing of falling stone after bombardments, the sudden silence before another attack began. Others remembered the weather more than the enemy itself. Cold rain soaking uniforms for days at a time, mud pulling at boots during uphill assaults, fog swallowing entire ridgelines until soldiers could barely recognize the terrain around them. For many veterans, the mountain became less a place and more a feeling they could never fully escape. Some soldiers later confessed that they stopped seeing Monte Cassino as part of Italy altogether. In their memories, it became its own separate world, cut off from normal life by exhaustion, fear, and destruction. Men who had survived North Africa, Sicily, and earlier campaigns often described Cassino as uniquely draining because there seemed to be no safe moment anywhere on the battlefield. Even rest areas remained under threat from artillery and air attacks. Sleep came in short fragments. Food arrived cold or late. Reinforcements disappeared into the same ruined valleys where previous assaults had already failed. Over time, the battle created a strange numbness among many troops. They stopped asking how long the fighting would continue because nobody seemed to know the answer. And perhaps that was what made the mountains so terrifying. It was not simply the danger, it was the feeling that the battle might never truly end. Historians would later debate the bombing of the abbey for decades. Some argued it was necessary. Others believed it created a stronger defensive position for the Germans. Military experts analyzed tactics, terrain, and command decisions from every angle. But the soldiers who fought there often remembered something much simpler. They remembered the exhaustion. They remembered climbing uphill through smoke and rubble, wondering if they would survive another day. And above all, they remembered how the mountain slowly stripped away the illusion that war was about glory, momentum, or heroic breakthroughs. At Monte Cassino, war became endurance. It became survival. And for thousands of men on both sides, the scars left behind did not disappear when the guns finally fell silent. Even after the battle moved north, and Allied forces continued advancing toward Rome, the mountain remained behind, like a shadow hanging over everyone who had fought there. Soldiers leaving the Cassino sector often expected relief once they escaped the ruined valleys and shattered slopes, but many quickly realized the battle had followed them. During quiet moments, veterans still reacted to distant thunder as though artillery was returning. Some woke suddenly during the night, expecting incoming shell fire or shouted orders echoing through darkness. Others found themselves remembering small details they could never fully forget. The sound of boots slipping on wet stone. The smell of damp earth after endless rain. The sight of exhausted men staring silently uphill before another assault began. Monte Cassino stayed with them because it had pushed soldiers beyond simple fear. It had forced them into a state where exhaustion and survival became more important than victory itself. What made the battle so psychologically draining was how slowly hope disappeared there. Most campaigns during the war still carried moments of momentum. Armies advanced, cities fell, front lines shifted dramatically, but beneath the mountain, progress often measured only a few hundred yards after weeks of fighting. Entire attacks disappeared into smoke and rubble without changing the battlefield at all. Soldiers learned not to expect breakthroughs. They expected delays, counterattacks, rain, mud, and another exhausting climb uphill. That slow grind wore men down in ways many had never experienced before. Some veterans later admitted they stopped thinking about the future completely while fighting there. The war became reduced to immediate survival. Stay warm, stay awake, stay alive until morning. Historians would later remember Monte Cassino as one of the most difficult and controversial battles of the Italian campaign. But for those who fought there, statistics and strategy mattered far less than memory. The battlefield had gathered soldiers from across the world into one brutal struggle beneath the same ruined mountain. Americans fought beside British troops. Polish soldiers climbed ridges where French colonial forces attacked neighboring hillsides. Indian troops advanced through valleys, while New Zealand units struggled through destroyed villages. Different languages filled the front lines, but exhaustion sounded the same in every army. And perhaps that became one of the strangest truths about the battle. The mountain erased illusions of glory equally for everyone who entered it. By the time Rome finally fell in June 1944, Monte Cassino was already becoming legend among Allied troops. New arrivals to Italy heard stories about the battlefield before they ever saw it themselves. Veterans spoke of the mountain in quiet voices, describing endless rain, collapsing ruins, sleepless nights, and the terrifying feeling that the terrain itself wanted to kill them. Some called it the hardest battle of their entire war. Others refused to speak about it at all. Yet, despite everything sacrificed there, The battle also exposed something deeply human beneath the destruction. Soldiers from nations separated by language, culture, and geography had endured the same nightmare together beneath the same mountain. They shared exhaustion, fear, confusion, and the desperate hope that somehow the next assault might finally end the nightmare. But for many of them, the real ending never came. Because long after the ruins were abandoned and the guns moved north toward the final stages of the war in Europe, Monte Cassino remained frozen in memory exactly as they had left it. A shattered mountain beneath cold skies, where thousands of soldiers discovered how fragile endurance could become when war turned into pure survival. Years after the war ended, long after the roads to Rome reopened and the ruins of Europe slowly began rebuilding themselves, survivors of Monte Cassino still spoke about the mountain in ways that unsettled even other veterans. Many had fought in multiple campaigns across Europe and North Africa. They had seen cities destroyed, armies collapse, and entire front lines vanish beneath artillery and smoke. Yet something about Cassino remained different in their memories. It was not only the destruction, it was the feeling that the mountain had slowly stripped men down to their absolute limits and forced them to continue climbing anyway. Some veterans returned to Italy decades later and barely recognized the battlefield. The abbey had been rebuilt stone by stone. Grass-covered slopes that were once scarred by shell craters and shattered walls. Birds now moved through valleys that had once echoed with artillery day and night. Tourists walked quietly through restored courtyards where exhausted soldiers once searched for shelter among ruins and falling debris. From a distance, Monte Cassino appeared peaceful again, almost untouched by the nightmare that had consumed it during 1944. But for the men who survived the battle, the mountain never truly returned to peace. Many carried the memory privately for the rest of their lives. Some rarely spoke about the experience at all. Others described recurring dreams of foggy slopes, collapsing stone, and endless uphill climbs beneath dark skies. Families later recalled fathers and grandfathers suddenly falling silent whenever Italy or the war was mentioned. A few veterans admitted they could still remember the exact smell of wet earth and broken stone decades later. That was the strange legacy of Monte Cassino. The battle ended, but the atmosphere never completely disappeared from the minds of the people who were there. Historians continue debating the military decisions surrounding the campaign even now. They analyze whether the bombing of the abbey was necessary, whether the assaults could have been planned differently, or whether the Gustav Line might have collapsed sooner through another strategy entirely. Yet no argument can fully explain what the battlefield felt like to the exhausted soldiers trapped beneath those mountains for months. Because beyond tactics and strategy, Monte Cassino revealed something deeply unsettling about modern war. It showed how quickly human beings could become trapped inside a cycle of endurance where survival itself replaced every larger purpose. The battle became less about Rome, less about victory, and less about defeating an enemy. It became about continuing forward despite exhaustion, fear, rain, confusion, and the terrifying belief that the mountain might never let anyone leave. And perhaps that is why Monte Cassino still feels haunting even today. Somewhere beneath the rebuilt monastery and quiet hillsides lies the memory of thousands of men from different nations who climbed into the same nightmare and discovered the same terrible truth. That sometimes the most frightening battlefields are not the ones remembered for dramatic breakthroughs or famous victories. Sometimes they are remembered because the men who survived them never truly escaped them at all. Even now, visitors standing near the abbey during quiet evenings sometimes describe an eerie silence settling over the valley as fog drifts across the mountainside. The wind moves through the stones. The hills grow dark, and for a brief moment, it becomes strangely easy to imagine exhausted soldiers still climbing upward through rain and smoke somewhere beneath the shadows, disappearing into the mountain exactly as they did in 1944. Leaving behind one final question that history can never fully answer. How many men walked away from Monte Cassino alive, yet never truly left it behind?